Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the launch of this Lowy Institute analysis today. China, of course, is a subject that everyone is talking about. Everyone who's interested in the world is talking about these days. As we've seen in the course of our very long debate over Hugh White's recent quarterly essay on the Interpreter blog, China is also a subject on which most people disagree. Everyone's got an opinion, and usually those opinions are very different. So it's a great delight for us to be launching this paper that takes a very close look at Chinese foreign policy in a particular context, the context of the United Nations. It's been written by Michael Fullilove. Michael, most of you will know, is the director of our Global Issues program. Michael is a graduate of the Universities of New South Wales, Sydney and Oxford. He is very widely published. He has been running our Global Issues program and conducting research at the Institute for a long time. He was the very first Lowy Institute researcher. In addition to writing on diasporas, to writing on the death penalty, to writing on a large number of topics, Michael has, over the years, written quite a bit on China and its foreign policy. I think it was back in September of 2006, Michael, that you published an article in the American journal The National Interest on China and the UN. And so Michael has also done work on China and the European Union and, of course, US-China relations. This particular piece of work was undertaken with the support of the Australia-China Council, and we thank the ACC for supporting Michael in that work. The way that today's event will run is that Michael will speak for about 20 or 25 minutes. He will outline a lot of the information, and it's a very rich analysis. There's a lot of information in there. And then I'll join him up here. I'll ask him a few questions and then start to involve the audience in the conversation. So without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Michael Fullilove.
Well, thank you very much, Michael. And I'm very grateful to Michael not only for chairing today's session, but indeed for flying back from Adelaide for it. So thank you for that, and I look forward to the discussion. You'll recall that in December last year, representatives of 192 nations, plus journalists, activists, and business executives assembled in Copenhagen for the 15th Conference of the Parties to the UNFCCC. And the goal was to strike a new international agreement on climate change to replace the Kyoto Protocol, one that would lead to meaningful reductions of greenhouse gas emissions. Expectations were high, and there was speculation that one of the key players in doing a deal would be China. After all, China, the world's largest emitter of greenhouse gases, has taken huge strides in the past decades, toughening up its environment protection laws, fighting pollution, planting forests, and investing aggressively in renewables and energy efficiency. In the end, Copenhagen was a flop. There were many reasons for this, and responsibility is probably fairly shared across the world, but I think in the public mind at least it's fair to say that China copped a lot of the blame. The Chinese opposed quantifiable commitments, they opposed the principle of international verification, and it's also fair to say, I think, that they didn't acquit themselves well in the conference venue. You may recall Premier Wen Jiabao dodging a meeting with President Barack Obama and sending a more junior official to represent him. And it seemed to me that China's predicament in Copenhagen illustrated in miniature many of the features of China's awkward relationship with the United Nations. The high hopes, the genuine, often startling progress, the continuing disconnect between China's weight and its strategy, its conflicting desires to be seen as both a great power and a poor country, the tacking between arrogance and uncertainty, and the hurt feelings on both sides when expectations are crushed. And it seemed to me that Copenhagen put the following question in front of the international community. How far has China progressed toward achieving the status urged on it by Bob Zoellick in 2005, that of a responsible stakeholder? And I thought this would be a good topic for research. Now, in recent years, as Michael alluded to, 1,000 papers on Chinese foreign policy have bloomed. And this paper tries to be different by taking one particular aspect that hasn't received much attention, and that is China's approach to the United Nations. Why? First of all, China's performance at the UN is important in itself. Secondly, it serves something as a global proxy, I should say, for China's global strategy. The paper is based in part on interviews that I conducted in Beijing, Washington and New York, with the support, as Michael mentioned, of the Australia-China Council, to which I'm very grateful. So let me make this argument. First of all, just to touch very briefly on China's rise. Any account of Beijing's foreign policy behaviour has to start with its deeply impressive economic performance, which is mirrored by its growing military capabilities. There's a lot on those topics in the paper, but I won't labour the point for this audience. Suffice to say, China has arrived as a great power. That doesn't mean it's destined for global hegemony or even regional hegemony, as some enthusiasts maintain. But whatever you think about straight-line projections, it's clear that China is a global player with vast implications for the international system. So China has a strong hand. How it will play that hand in the future is not so obvious. There is a notable dualism to China's approach. On the one hand, Deng Xiaoping told his countrymen to keep their heads down and keep them focused on economic development. And even as this approach has given way to other foreign policy doctrines of peaceful rise and harmonious world, the Chinese leadership remains overwhelmingly focused on domestic issues. That was a strong impression that I picked up in Beijing. The Communist Party's first priority is regime continuity, and that requires a stable society, a viable economy, and sufficient GDP growth to keep unemployment down. And as a result, for most of the time, China's external preoccupations are to prevent other powers from trespassing on what it regards as domestic issues, like Taiwan and Tibet, and to secure the energy and other resources it needs to power growth. Chinese foreign policy is not expansionary or extreme, and in many ways, China has been slow to claim the influence it clearly deserves. So that is the cautious side, if you like. But on the other hand, it's impossible to miss China's rising international ambition and confidence, even if they sit beside strains of caution and insecurity. China is expanding its clout in our part of the world. It's thickening its ties where it can with treaty allies of the United States. It's extending its influence all over the world. The US relationship, for example, which used to be managed very much on bilateral issues and on issues to do with the Chinese economy in particular, is now, the subjects for discussion are now global issues, not even regional or bilateral issues, global issues such as the international architecture and the world economy. So China has become a much more confident player. And sometimes, as we know, that assertiveness spills over into bluster. And some long-time observers, in my experience, are pessimistic about the direction of Chinese foreign policy. Something has switched in the past 5 years, one said to me. Often Australian commentators find fault with Canberra for the difficulties in our bilateral relationship with China. But it's notable that the same frictions have manifested in many of China's relationships in the last year or two, with Europe, India, countries in Southeast Asia, even with Russia. The US relationship has proved particularly bumpy. The relationship with Tokyo suffered a very significant setback over the sea trawler incident recently. Now, why is this happening? Why is there this current friction in Chinese foreign policy? There are many explanations, including the ongoing leadership transition in Beijing, Chinese nationalism, the confidence that China has gained from successfully navigating the global financial crisis. A recent policy paper from CIPRI makes a powerful argument for the increasing pluralisation of Chinese foreign policy as authority over the policy-making process fractures, and even Hu Jintao is required to accommodate different factions at the same time. And certainly you see an uneven quality to China's foreign policy, usually quiet but sometimes strident, usually cautious but sometimes combative, always prickly, never entirely predictable. That same ambivalence is evident in China's relations with the United Nations. China has quickened the pace of its interactions with the UN. It exerts increasing influence in UN forums on matters it cares about. Yet, in my opinion, it has not yet assumed the responsibilities incumbent upon a global power. I think the Chinese appreciate two particular advantages the UN offers them as an arena for power politics. The first is the UN's structural design mitigates unipolarity. What I mean by that is even at the height of American power, America couldn't have its way in the UN. It's only one voice among a multitude in the General Assembly, and even in the Security Council, it's only one of 5 permanent members. But at the same time, the UN is hierarchical, and I think this is the other aspect that the Chinese have always liked. China is on the top rung of the hierarchy as a veto-wielding member of the Permanent 5 or the P5. So how should we assess China's current mode of engagement with the UN? The approach differs on the issue, and I felt you could draw a continuum of China's UN behaviour, and you could rank the different ways in which China engages with the UN on a spectrum where the policy's position is determined by the degree of openness to, engagement with and burden sharing on behalf of the international organisation. I call this China's stakeholder spectrum. And what I might do is just very quickly run through the items on the spectrum from engagement with the UN at the top down to disengagement at the bottom. Starting at the top, I think I would place the issue of the calibre of China's UN diplomats. The quality of people China sends to New York has improved markedly. 30 years ago, they said nothing. As a UN insider told me, Beijing's representatives used to be woefully unqualified, faceless apparatchiks. China used to be obsessed with protecting their diplomats in New York from outside influence. Now it's the opposite. China sends high-quality diplomats and tries to project their influence through their people. I should say that elements of the old mentality still persist. Some of you may have seen a couple of months ago when China's most senior UN official, Under-Secretary General Xia Zhukang, was forced to apologise after a toast he made at an Alpine retreat that descended into a drunken rant against the Americans and Ban Ki-moon and the United Nations. But I think that was the exception that proved the rule. In general, China's representatives have become much more skillful at promoting their country's interests at UN headquarters. And so I put diplomats at the top of the spectrum. I think also towards the engagement end of the spectrum is China's contribution to UN peacekeeping. And this is probably the field where China has moved the furthest. In the old days, Beijing characterised peacekeeping operations as imperialist adventures. But then in the 80s, the ice began to crack. China first voted for a peacekeeping operation, then it began to support them financially, and finally it deployed its first personnel to peacekeeping operations in Africa and the Middle East. And in the last 2 decades, the Chinese contribution has grown further. China now staffs peacekeeping operations in quite significant numbers. And I think it's interesting that Chinese officials have managed to bring about this shift and this increase in deployment of staff in particular in the absence of international pressure. It's not like the world was pushing them to do it. And over some internal objections from their colleagues based on history or ideology, over the objections of some in the military about fear of casualties, they have now got to a point where they deploy more personnel to UN peacekeeping operations than any other permanent member of the Security Council, and China is the 15th largest contributor overall. I don't want to overstate the progress made in peacekeeping. Chinese votes on peacekeeping are still difficult to get out of them, and it's still conditioned by their regard for state sovereignty in particular and the principles of consent from the host country, the minimum use of force and the involvement of countries from the region. It's also true that although the number of people that China has deployed is high relative to the past and relative to other P5 members, it's still small in absolute terms, about 2,000 people the last time I looked, and as we know, there are over 2 million personnel in the Chinese armed forces. And China tends not to send combat troops, but rather enablers, military observers and police. Nevertheless, this is a huge shift in the last 2 decades. A little further down the spectrum, I put the responsibility to protect. Those of you who are not UN groupies may not be familiar with this. It's the idea that after Somalia, Bosnia, Herzegovina, Rwanda and Kosovo, a collective international responsibility exists in the case of genocide, ethnic cleansing and widespread violations of human rights. That if a state can't deal with these issues, then state sovereignty yields to the international responsibility to protect them. Now, obviously, this has the potential to do violence to the concept of state sovereignty, and China has exhibited some discomfort about the implications, but it hasn't opposed it outright. Rather, China takes a very limited view of the responsibility to protect and its application, and it resists attempts to invoke it. So, in other words, China's position is nuanced. It is not completely opposed to responsibility to protect, as you may have expected a decade or 2 ago, but equally, it's not very comfortable with it. Now, it may be that in light of the imbroglios in Afghanistan and Iraq, maybe we don't have to think about this. Maybe the high water mark for humanitarian intervention has passed, and these issues are not going to come before the Security Council again. However, if we had the occurrence of another Rwanda, God forbid, then I think this issue would come screaming back to the fore in New York. So I think it's important to think about it. Further down the spectrum in the middle, I guess, is the broad issue of Security Council behaviour. And here, as we get sort of further towards disengagement, you can see both the extent of China's shifts, but also the limits of its shifts. Historically, China was a very passive member of the Security Council. It didn't vote. It preferred not to vote. It preferred not to participate or to abstain from votes. It tried not to shape deliberations or to speak very much. It used its veto very little. China only used its veto, for example, 4 times between 1971 and 2002, compared to 75 times for the United States. In the past decade and a half, China has grown in confidence. It now is willing to take the lead on issues occasionally in the Security Council and behave more like a normal great power, and it's being treated more like a normal great power by the other permanent members of the Security Council, including the United States. P5 diplomats and UN officials who I interviewed said that China's Security Council diplomacy is smarter and more subtle than the Russians. The Chinese are more reliable in sticking to deals that they've struck. China has developed a good working relationship with the United States in the Security Council, although it's not the P2 that people spoke about a few years ago, when China and the UN would sit down and together resolve all the issues facing the United Nations. So that's the good news, and yet China still provides substantial cover to pariah states like Sudan and Zimbabwe in the Security Council. I won't dwell on this in these remarks, but we can come back to it if people are interested. And on issues where China's core interests are not engaged, China is strangely disengaged for such a big power. For example, on Afghanistan, it rarely says anything. It's really only concerned to make sure that Pakistan is happy with what the Security Council is doing on Afghanistan. The majority of action on all the difficult issues in New York still comes from what they call the P3, the United States, Britain and France. China remains uncomfortable about being isolated. In other words, China in the Security Council is preoccupied with protecting its interests and protecting the interests of its allies, but not projecting its influence, not guiding the way the Security Council considers issues. And I think that this weakness was camouflaged, in particular during the Bush administration, because of the various pratfalls of the administration and their permanent representative, John Bolton. But I think since that's been taken out of the equation, I think more scrutiny is coming onto China and how it behaves in the Security Council. I think you can see this tension that I'm talking about in the next 2 issues on the spectrum, Iran and North Korea. First of all, Iran. I think China's performance on Iran has been unimpressive. Along with Russia, China pursues a delay and weaken strategy in relation to Security Council sanctions. And even when it accepts even when it signs on to sanctions, as it did, for example, earlier this year, it's only after months of haggling, after attempts to dilute the sanctions, and in particular in China's case, after receiving various incentives and assurances from the Saudis and others that their interests wouldn't be negatively affected. Now, Beijing's interests on Iran are not identical to Western interests, and I want to be clear about that. I'm not saying that China should behave exactly as we do. China is a significant consumer of Iranian energy, taking 11% of its crude oil from Iran. It is interested in the country's oil and gas reserves. It sees Iran as an important partner in the Middle East, perhaps as a counterweight to the United States, as an important partner in Central and Southwest Asia. Given China's attachment to state sovereignty, it is uncomfortable with sanctions, given that it itself has been the subject of many sanctions over the years. It doesn't like the idea of sanctions. It's more liable to rest on Iran's right to develop nuclear technology for peaceful purposes. So those are perfectly legitimate interests. And yet I have to say, in my opinion, this approach seems short-sighted given what's at stake for the world and for China as a key player in the international system. An Iranian bomb would likely embolden a regime with links to Hezbollah and other terrorist groups. It would endanger strategic waterways. It would almost certainly drive up the price of oil. It would threaten regional states, including key Gulf states that China wants to keep on side, that also distrust Iran, and it would contribute to regional and global nuclear proliferation. For China, a nuclear-armed Iran would mean rising oil prices and the degradation of China's status as its relative status as a nuclear weapons state, because there'd be another nuclear weapons state in the world, in fact, quite close to China. And so it does seem to me that China is defining its interests on this issue a little narrowly. North Korea, I think, is a harder issue for China. We have to acknowledge that. China was the DPRK's chief protector and quartermaster during the Cold War. There are lots of personal and historical ties between the country. A lot of Chinese people gave their blood for their North Korean comrades. And most importantly, there are strong political and security interests for China when it comes to North Korea. China does not want to see a collapsed state on its eastern border, which would mean tens of thousands of refugees flooding into China. And equally, it doesn't want to see a strong state on its eastern border in the form of a reunified Korea that is aligned to the West. It doesn't want to see that either. I understand all that. On the other hand, how comforting is it to suffer a highly unpredictable, not to say unhinged, family-owned regime on your eastern border? I was very struck when I was in China, and various Chinese pointed out to me how much thicker China's economic ties are with South Korea than with North Korea, and we looked up the figures. There are 25 times more commercial flights between China and South Korea than between China and North Korea, and 50 times as much total trade. So it does seem to me the interests are a bit more balanced than perhaps China perceives them as such. This year, of course, this debate has played out against the backdrop of an awkward political transition in Pyongyang and against the background of North Korea's presumed sinking of the South Korean corvette Cheonan in March with 46 fatalities. It did seem to me, and if we just take that as a case study of how China is thinking about its relationship to North Korea and its relationship with the rest of the world, it did seem to me that China's response that North Korea's role was unproven lacked credibility. And I think that Obama correctly characterised this as willful blindness. So after the sinking of that corvette, the US and South Korea engaged in naval manoeuvres off the Korean Peninsula. China engaged in diplomatic manoeuvres in New York, and they managed to confine the Security Council's response to a weak statement from the President of the Security Council. So not a Security Council resolution, but a presidential statement, which is much less significant. So it comes down to this. The response of the international organisation to the unprovoked sinking of a warship with substantial loss of life, which is the very definition, you would have thought, of a threat to international peace and security with which the UN Security Council is charged. The international organisation's response to that was a lame presidential statement that did not even directly name the attacker. It seems to me this was bad for the credibility of the United Nations, but it also seems to me it was bad for the credibility of China. Now, last month, of course, we've had further provocations from North Korea, revealing the existence of a new uranium enrichment facility and launching a deadly artillery barrage at South Korean territory. And that may come before the Security Council, and I think that would provide another difficult test for the Security Council and another difficult test for China. And perhaps the prior test will be if it even manages to get to the Security Council at all. The final issue is human rights, right at the end of the disengagement, end, I should say, of the stakeholder spectrum. As we know, Beijing is largely hostile to independent international scrutiny of its own human rights records, as we've seen recently in the Nobel Peace Prize case. It also takes an obstructionist approach to the scrutiny of the human rights records of other countries. That's not, I mean, it's not entirely that way, and sometimes it tacks, but you would have to say that overall, China has played a role in the last decade or so of pushing human rights further to the periphery of UN debate. So that's the stakeholder spectrum. Let me just make a couple of concluding remarks. I think China has become, as I've tried to argue, a far more effective player in the United Nations, sometimes even outperforming the United States. Yet the last 5 years have also defined more clearly, for me, the limits of Beijing's conversion. When I last looked at this, as Michael mentioned, for the national interest about 5 years ago, it did seem to me that these issues were moving up the spectrum. And when I look at it now, it seems to me that they've stabilised or perhaps even slipped down a little bit. China continues to define its national interests narrowly and pursue them with an uncompromising resolve. China wants respect, but not responsibility. It is reluctant to bind its own freedom of movement and subsume it within an international organisation in the way the US did after the Second World War, even though Washington's relative power then was much greater than Beijing's power now. As I said, this is not to say that China's interests exactly coincide with our interests, and I wouldn't argue either that China should work always in the global interest and ignore its national interest, because that's unrealistic. But I do think that as a country's wealth and power expand, so do its interests expand. And I don't think that a middle power foreign policy is adequate for a great power. I think that Beijing could strike a new balance between its traditional economic and security concerns and the broader imperatives it must satisfy as a global power, including stable relations with other great powers, nuclear non-proliferation, and the development of international prestige. I think that China's UN performance has escaped scrutiny in the last 10 or 20 years. I think the world's head has been turned by American power and then by American overreach in Iraq in particular. But I think that pattern will not hold. I think the old principle that with power comes responsibility will operate to move China up the spectrum, or at least put pressure in that direction. On the other hand, there's a caveat that I'd like to end with, and that is that the West needs to be careful what it wishes for. Because if I was to be a little self-critical, I would say that analysts in Washington and Canberra and Sydney want Beijing to be more responsible and more active, but we don't always like it when Beijing is more assertive. China's version of stepping up is not necessarily the same as the West's. And as a Chinese scholar argued recently, a stronger China in the future may be less concerned about external powers intervening in China's domestic affairs, because they can't, because China is stronger and better able to resist it, but that China may also be less fussy about observing the principle of non-interference in other states' domestic affairs. How would the West feel, for example, about China involving itself in the Middle East peace process or throwing its weight around in ways that contradicted our interests directly or indirectly? In other words, ladies and gentlemen, the responsibilities and the prerogatives of a stakeholder are open to interpretation. And in the future, Beijing may put forward its own, quite different stakeholder spectrum. Thank you.